The wind off the North Sea carried a bite that evening as we arrived at Linthill House, its vast stone silhouette rising from the moors like a monument to secrets. The grounds were silent but not still. An old hush clung to the ivy-wrapped walls, disturbed only by the creak of our carriage and the low murmur of shifting trees. Hercule Poirot, already adjusting the cuffs of his dove-gray coat, stepped onto the gravel with his usual poise, though I caught the briefest glance he gave to the upper window of the east tower. "Linthill," he said softly, "is not merely a house, Hastings. It is a place that has learned to hold its breath." We had been summoned by Lady Frances Hume, widow of the estate's last heir. Her letter had been unusual, carefully worded, and signed at the end, and lacking even the formality of sealing wax. What stood out most was the single phrase she had underlined. "The 13th step has been replaced. The memory is not gone. Come before someone ensures it is." Inside, the house met us with the scent of soot, old paper, and age-worn fabric. The entrance hall was lined with oil portraits. Many turned slightly askew, as though disturbed by wind, or hands too uncertain to straighten them. The butler, Mr. Loud, greeted us with a worn dignity and led us to the drawing-room, where a fire struggled in the grate. Lady Frances sat stiffly in an armchair, her hands tightly folded in her lap. Her hair was pinned in a manner both elegant and defensive, and her eyes, sharp, pale, always watching, seemed to anticipate questions before they were asked. "I'm glad you came," she said without rising. "There are matters here that have waited too long. My aunt's memory, it will not stay buried." Poirot bowed with gentle precision. "You refer to Lady Margaret Hume, I presume?" "She died on these stairs," Frances said. "And before she did, she tried to set things right. She left clues, letters, keys, a changed will. But nothing was ever found. Or rather, nothing that anyone was willing to admit to finding." Her voice trailed off as Poirot stepped toward the hearth. On the mantel sat a single-framed photograph, a young woman in 18th-century dress, standing beside an oak staircase. Her posture was firm, her eyes direct. Poirot turned to Lady Frances. "She appears unafraid," he said. Frances nodded. That was Margaret's way. She believed character outweighed blood. It did not make her popular in this family. There was a pause. Poirot's attention had shifted, subtly, naturally, to the 13th step of the grand staircase, just beyond the drawing-room threshold. He walked to it, knelt briefly, and ran a gloved finger across the edge of the wood. "The grain is different here," he said. "It's been replaced." Frances flinched. "Yes, after her fall. Or her murder," Poirot said softly. "She was found with a wound to the head, not consistent with a fall. That, too, was quietly dismissed, was it not?" Frances's silence was answer enough. Poirot turned, his voice lowering. "And the silver key?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her skirt. "Gone. Stolen from around her neck, before the doctor even arrived. But I believe she made a second." "She would be wise to do so," Poirot murmured. A long silence followed, and then she rose slowly, as if it cost her something. From a side table, she retrieved a velvet bundle and handed it to him. "These pages," she said, "were found years later, among the effects of Dr. Forbes, her physician. They are fragments only, medical notes, mostly. But I believe he had something in them, something he dared not speak aloud." Poirot unwrapped the pages carefully. As the fire crackled behind him, he held one sheet up to the light. "This page," he said, "has been steamed. Someone read it. Recently." And in that moment, I swear I felt something shift in the air, a weight in the house, a breath behind the walls. "The past," Poirot said, folding the papers again, "has been tampered with, but not erased. That is why we are here, Hastings. Linthill is not finished telling its story." Outside, the wind stirred the hedges, and I glanced toward the staircase again. For a moment, I imagined a woman's voice, clear, sharp, unafraid, echoing from the 13th step, not calling for help, but for justice. The next morning brought no sun, only a chalky sky pressing low against the house like a weight. Mist gathered along the hedgerows, and the moor beyond Linthill seemed to retreat into itself, as if the land knew better than to remember. Hercule Poirot was already dressed when I entered the breakfast room, his cravat immaculate, his eyes fixed on the faded velvet box containing Lady Margaret's pages. He did not touch them. He merely looked. "Today, mon ami," he said, "we begin where all things begin, beneath the surface." It was Lady Frances who insisted we meet the household formally. She had summoned the remaining residents and staff to the drawing-room by midday. There were only a handful: the new heir, Mr. Ian Hume, a man of rigid posture and a face carved by control rather than character; Miss Eliza Drummond, Lady Frances's personal secretary; Mr. Alan Grant, the newly hired groundskeeper; and, of course, Marlowe, the butler, who stood a half-step behind the others, hands folded in front of him like a man guarding ghosts. Lady Frances introduced them briskly, then stood back. "I have asked them to make themselves available," she said. "Whether they'll be helpful is another matter entirely." Poirot stepped forward, his expression pleasant, his tone neutral. "It is not help I require, madam, only honesty." The silence that followed was not defiance. It was calculation. Mr. Ian Hume spoke first, stepping forward with a tight smile and outstretched hand. "You're not here for ghost stories, I take it." Poirot did not shake his hand. He only nodded. "Ghosts rarely leave fingerprints, monsieur. But fraud, murder, and theft they often do." Ian's smile thinned. "There's nothing to steal. The estate is in decline." Poirot's eyes flicked to Ian's signet ring. Curious, then, that such a modest estate affords new engraving on an heirloom ring. Ian's fingers curled slightly. "Tradition has value." "Indeed," Poirot said, "especially when it must be forged." The room chilled. Eliza shifted slightly where she stood, her eyes dropping to the floor. Poirot noticed, of course. He turned gently to her. "Miss Drummond, may I say, your locket is most elegant. May I?" She hesitated. "It belonged to my grandmother." Poirot extended a hand. With obvious reluctance, she removed the locket and passed it to him. Inside was a miniature portrait, delicate and old, and tucked behind it, a silver key, small and worn smooth. Poirot held it delicately between two fingers. "Most interesting. This key. It appears to fit something significant." "I don't know what it opens," Eliza said too quickly. "But you kept it close," Poirot replied gently, "even though its use is unknown. Curious, is it not?" Her eyes flickered. Next came Mr. Alan Grant, who had said little thus far. A man of rough edges and quiet movements. He carried himself like someone used to watching from the edge of things. "Mr. Grant," Poirot said, "you're new to Linthill, yet you speak of the land as though it remembers you." Alan hesitated, then nodded once. "My grandmother spoke of this place. Said we had family tied here, long ago. A story passed down. A lady wronged. A will stolen." Poirot's expression sharpened almost imperceptibly. "And you believed her?" "She said the truth always finds a way," Alan replied. "And you?" Poirot turned to Eliza again. "Do you believe the same?" She looked up, eyes bright, uncertain. "I think some truths wait for the right ears, and the right courage." "Then perhaps," Poirot said, "those ears have finally arrived." The silence that followed was different now, weighted not by suspicion, but by something else. Anticipation. As the room dispersed, Poirot lingered near the hearth, examining the scorched wood and the aging family portraits above. Then, with a soft exhale, he turned to me. "Hastings," he said quietly, "do you know what I find most telling?" "What's that?" "Everyone in this house," he said, "is pretending to know less than they do. But Miss Drummond, she pretends to know more." Outside, the wind pressed against the glass, and in the shadow of the stairwell, I thought I heard a creak. The house was listening, and somewhere so was the past. The next morning broke gray and unmoving, as though even the sky hesitated to disturb the uneasy silence that clung to Linthill House. Poirot stood near the tall window of the guest suite, not looking out toward the gardens or the sea, but staring down the hallway beyond the staircase, his gaze oddly fixed, thoughtful, as if following the echo of something no one else could hear. He said nothing until breakfast. Then, while spreading marmalade with quiet precision, he murmured, There's a place where memory speaks louder than footsteps. We shall visit it this morning." I assumed he meant the chapel, or perhaps the mausoleum we'd glimpsed in the distance on our arrival. But instead, Poirot requested to be taken to the north wing, the oldest, most forgotten part of the house. Lady Frances hesitated. "It's been sealed for years," she said, a touch too quickly. "Rats, mildew, the roof leaks. It's not safe." Poirot offered only a quiet smile. "Then it is the perfect place to look. Truth prefers the company of dust." With clear reluctance, she led us down the east corridor, past curtains that hadn't been drawn in years, and through air that smelled of mildew, old papers, and something older still, something unspoken. At the end of the hallway, she stopped at a narrow wooden door, its edges warped by time. "This is where it happened," she whispered, "where Miss Drummond was nearly hurt." The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dim corridor filled with discarded furniture and tattered drapes. Halfway down, a large iron wall sconce lay shattered across the stone floor, its rusted base twisted and broken. Poirot crouched beside it immediately. "This was no accident," he said calmly. "See here, scrape marks, loosened screws, fresh scratches. Someone wanted this to fall." Lady Frances grew pale. Why would anyone want to harm Eliza? Poirot didn't answer directly. Instead, he walked further down the corridor and turned toward the wall. There, nearly swallowed by shadow, a spiral staircase twisted upward, half hidden, half rotten. Its edges were worn smooth, and a few steps had crumbled entirely. "I've seen this before," came a voice behind us. Eliza Drummond stood at the threshold, pale but steady. "I found it mentioned in Lady Margaret's letters," she said. "She called it the path where light does not reach. I've been exploring it in secret." Poirot's gaze didn't waver. "And yet you did not mention this when we arrived." "I wasn't sure who I could trust," she replied quietly. "Even now I'm not." Poirot studied her with the same calm, surgical gaze he used on murder scenes. "The dust on your boots," he said softly, "matches the dust on these stairs. And there's a tear on the hem of your dress, precisely where it would catch on this stone." She did not deny it. Poirot stepped to the base of the stair and touched the wall with one gloved hand. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately, then stopped. "There is something here. Bring the light, Hastings." I stepped forward with the lantern. The flame flickered as I raised it, revealing a faint seam in the paneling, barely visible unless the light struck it just right. Poirot pressed gently. With a soft click, the wall shifted. A narrow hidden panel swung open, revealing a hollow chamber built into the stone. Inside sat a single wooden box, bearing the Hume family crest. A faded indentation beside it suggested that something else had once rested there, and had since been taken or hidden elsewhere. Poirot turned to Eliza. "Your key, mademoiselle, if you please." With trembling hands, she passed it to him. The key slid into the lock with a soft metallic sigh. Inside the box lay a bundle of yellow documents wrapped in linen and wax paper. Beneath them, a thin ledger bound in worn green leather. At the very bottom, Poirot found a folded letter, aged but intact, addressed in elegant, spidery script, to be opened only if my voice is silenced. M.H. Poirot unfolded the letter with reverence and read silently. His expression shifted, first to focus, then to sorrow. He closed it slowly, thoughtfully. "This," he said, almost to himself, "confirms what I feared. Someone in this house has lived a lie for decades." He looked up, eyes sharp now, reawakened. "We must read this where fire still burns and shadows cannot listen." As we turned to leave, I looked back once at the stairwell, and I could have sworn truly that one of the old portraits in the corridor had tilted ever so slightly, as if someone behind it had just stepped away. The drawing room was hushed, the fire's glow painting long shadows across the walls. Poirot placed the silver key on the table, his gaze fixed on Eliza Drummond. She sat still, eyes wide, her teacup untouched. Lady Frances remained rigid in her chair, while Alan Grant stood silently near the window, watching. Poirot rose. "We have found Lady Margaret's secret, her box, her key, her voice hidden in the cracks of Linthill stone. And now we hold what she died protecting, The truth. From his satchel, he withdrew a faded ledger and read aloud. August 1st, 1751. I have hidden the will where only Eliza or her descendants might find it. The key unlocks more than doors. It reveals the bloodline they try to erase. No one spoke. Poirot continued, unfolding a second letter. August 10th, 1751. If I die, let it be known I defended the idea that character matters more than lineage. My daughter's children must not be forgotten. Eliza whispered. She knew everything. She prepared for it. Poirot nodded. Lady Margaret turned her death into a message for the right eyes in the right time. Alan stepped closer to Eliza. You followed the trail. You found what they buried. Even Lady Frances, pale and shaken, gave a slow nod. Then Linthill belongs to the truth now. Poirot looked toward the hearth. The house has held this lie long enough. Tonight the silence ends. The morning broke in a hush, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Eliza sat at the breakfast table with a distant gaze, her fingertips resting absently on the edge of her teacup. Poirot, already dressed and alert, studied the key once more beneath the light from the east-facing window. He turned it slowly between his fingers, examining the fresh scratches along its teeth, then gently placed it down with a look of decision. We go to the north wing, he said softly, where the light does not reach, and where the truth waits in dust and silence. The corridor to the old wing was narrow, long forgotten, and filled with the scent of cold stone and damp wood. At the foot of a small spiral stair, a shattered wall sconce lay twisted on the floor. Lady Frances waited nearby, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. It was an accident, she offered weakly. A draught, perhaps. Poirot crouched by the broken fixture and ran his fingers over the iron bolts. No, madam, not an accident. The screws were deliberately loosened. Someone intended Miss Drummond to be standing beneath it when it fell. Eliza turned pale. I was here the night before. I heard whispering from the stairwell. It wasn't the wind. It was voices. Then the crash. Poirot nodded gravely. 3 sets of footprints, recent. See the wax residue here? Someone carried a candle. Someone searching, or perhaps guarding. The narrow staircase wound upward into darkness. Each step was uneven and worn by time, but Poirot ascended slowly, his fingers brushing the wall. There is a seam here, he murmured, halting. Hidden. A panel within the paneling. He turned to Eliza. The key, if you will. With a trembling hand, she passed him the silver key. Poirot pressed it gently into the panel's lock, and with a soft, groaning click, the door swung open, revealing a narrow chamber within the wall. Inside sat a simple wooden box, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with a faded red ribbon. Poirot opened it with care. Within, 2 bundles, one, a stack of legal documents tied with twine, the other, a letter in Lady Margaret's hand. If anything befalls me, know that the will is not lost. Eliza is my daughter, my true heir by blood and by choice. Let justice be done, though it tremble the bones of this house. Eliza's voice shook. She wrote everything, as if she knew she'd be silenced. Poirot gently closed the lid of the box. She was not only a mother, she was a strategist. She did not simply die. She set in motion an inheritance of truth. And somewhere in the house, beneath the floorboards and within the walls, the silence of Linthill House began to shift. No longer a veil, but a curtain about to rise. The drawing room had changed by the time we returned. What was once heavy with uncertainty now felt braced, like the hush before a storm finally breaks. The documents discovered in the secret stairs hollow lay across the table beneath the flickering lamplight, their ink faded but legible. Every word a tremor in the foundation of Linthill House. Lady Frances stood at a distance, her lips pressed into a thin line, while Eliza and Alan sat shoulder to shoulder, both pale, both quietly bracing themselves. Poirot moved with quiet purpose, spreading the contents of the box carefully. A faded will, sealed and signed by Margaret Hume. Letters in 2 hands, Lady Margaret's and Eliza Grant's. And tucked at the bottom, a small locked book. A journal, Poirot said softly. But more than that, it is a map through the lie that has endured for generations. With the key Eliza still held, he unlocked the leather-bound book and began to read aloud. September 12, 1750. I have told no one, not even Dr. Forbes. My daughter Eliza has grown strong in the care of Thomas, the coachman, and his wife. She believes I am her aunt, and perhaps that is for the best for now. But Andrew suspects, and that is dangerous beyond words. I must prepare the truth in layers. A false wool for Andrew's eyes, the real one for Eliza, hidden in the wall near the 13th step, where only she, or her blood, might find it. Poirot looked up. The room was deathly quiet. Eliza's hands were clenched, white-knuckled in her lap. Alan, beside her, stared not at the journal, but at Lady Frances. She had not spoken since we returned. Poirot continued. January 1751. Andrew is not mad. He is simply ruthless. He will stop at nothing. He has already taken steps to discredit my mind. His ambition is boundless. But he does not understand. I have placed my trust not in titles, but in truth. Eliza is the future. Not because she bears my blood, but because she understands its weight. Poirot closed the book. The silence that followed felt like an exhale, centuries long. Eliza Grant, he said gently, you are not just the heir by Lady Margaret's intent. You are her daughter's daughter, the last living thread of the Hume line that Lady Margaret trusted. And more than that, she trusted you to bring her justice. At this, Lady Frances finally spoke. I suspected, she said hoarsely, but I told myself it was coincidence. Her eyes, her manner. I could not bear the idea that the child we dismissed, the line we buried, would rise again. Poirot turned to her, not unkindly. And yet it has, madam, because the truth is not so easily buried. Even under centuries of silence, it waits, it breathes, and eventually it finds a voice. Eliza stood slowly, her voice steady despite the tremble in her limbs. Then it ends here. The lies, the bloodshed, the whispering walls. It ends tonight. Poirot nodded, his gaze drifting to the staircase beyond the doorway. Yes, he said quietly, but not until we learn who tried to silence you before the truth could rise. Not everyone in this house welcomes the light. And somewhere, deep within Linthill House, a floorboard creaked, soft, deliberate, like a warning, or a reply. That night, Linthill House felt like it was holding its breath. Every corridor seemed tighter. Every candle flame burned lower, as though the house itself anticipated what was coming. After dinner, Poirot called a gathering in the blue parlor, a long, wood-paneled room with faded portraits and books that had not been touched in decades. Eliza sat near the hearth, the newly discovered will beside her, its red ribbon like a bloodstain on the table. Alan stood behind her, watchful. Lady Frances, composed yet distant, kept to the window, while Mr. M'Leod, the old butler, lingered silently by the door, hands clasped behind his back. Poirot stood before us, his silhouette framed by the firelight, every detail of his attire immaculate. Yet there was a sharpness in his voice, a precision honed like a blade. This house, he began, has long harbored more than just its ghosts. It has harbored truths denied, bloodlines hidden, and crimes concealed under generations of silence. But Lady Margaret Hume did not die in vain. She left behind the truth, and more importantly, she left behind the means to find it. He turned toward Eliza. You, mademoiselle, were meant to bring that truth forward, and someone tried to stop you. We must ask, who had the most to lose? Ian Hume entered then, uninvited. I assume you mean me, he said with a sneer. The villain in this family tale. The impostor. Poirot remained calm. Not an impostor. A desperate man, perhaps. Desperate to hold on to a name, a legacy, that was never truly yours. Ian's jaw tightened. You have no proof. On the contrary, Poirot replied smoothly. Your ring, for example, it is freshly engraved. Not an heirloom, but a fabrication. And your papers, conveniently vague, easily forged. Ian laughed once, bitterly. And yet, I have lived here, supported this house, managed the estate. Indeed, Poirot said, but management does not equal inheritance. You feared what the truth might do. And so you watched Eliza, followed her movements, even attempted to sabotage her search. The sconce that fell in the north wing was no accident. Ian stepped forward. Prove it. Poirot nodded to Mr. M'Leod, who stepped forward quietly, something clutched in his hand, a strip of cloth torn and stained. I found this, M'Leod said. Caught on a rusted hinge near the hidden stairwell. Torn from your coat, Master Ian. The tailor's mark matches. Ian's face went pale. You were the one who followed Eliza up the forgotten stair. Poirot continued. You loosened the sconce, hoping she would fall, hoping the truth would remain buried. But Linthill House remembers, monsieur, just as Lady Margaret intended it to. The silence in the room was suffocating. Then Lady Frances spoke, her voice brittle. And what now? What justice is there for the dead? Poirot looked to her, then to Eliza. Justice, madam, is not always found in punishment. Sometimes it is found in restoration, in naming the truth aloud. Eliza rose slowly, the will in her hands. Then I name it now, she said. Lady Margaret Hume was murdered by her brother Andrew. Her estate was stolen by those who lied. I reclaim it, not for vengeance, but for truth. Ian looked at her with a strange, hollow expression. He said nothing more. Later that evening, as I passed the grand staircase, I paused at the 13th step. Poirot stood there, motionless, fingers tracing the grain of the wood. She fell here, he said softly. But before she did, she left a path. And tonight, someone finally walked it. And in the silence that followed, I could have sworn I heard the faintest sigh from the walls around us, as though the house itself, at long last, had exhaled. Morning at Linthill House arrived not with light, but with revelation. The storm of the previous night had passed, but its echoes lingered in the corridors. The house felt changed, its walls less oppressive, its silence less suffocating. Yet even as the truth began to settle, Hercule Poirot knew the shadows had not entirely lifted. There remained one final mystery, not just who had tried to silence Eliza, but what Lady Margaret had foreseen when she placed her trust in a bloodline nearly erased. After breakfast, Poirot asked for a quiet moment in the portrait gallery, that long, solemn corridor filled with ancestral faces. The oil paintings, dulled with age, stared down from their frames, some with dignity, others with judgment. But it was the large portrait of Lady Margaret that held Poirot's gaze. She stood tall in the painting, her hands resting lightly on a velvet-bound book, her eyes painted not in pride but in warning. And just beside her, nearly obscured by shadow, hung a smaller frame, once turned to the wall. Now it faced the room, restored to its rightful place. It was Eliza Grant, the first Eliza, a woman in her early 30s, proud, composed, her resemblance to the present Eliza undeniable. Poirot studied it closely, then spoke softly, as if to the air. She lived, he said, the daughter whom history tried to erase. Margaret gave her the truth, and in turn, she passed it forward, in secret, in silence, until now. Eliza entered then, hesitant. She stood beside Poirot and looked at the two portraits, one of the woman who birthed the line, and the other who carried it forward. I remember this painting from my childhood, she said, but I didn't understand who she was. No one told me. That, Poirot replied, was by design. The truth was kept hidden, not to deceive, but to protect. And now, mademoiselle, you have brought it into the light. She nodded, her voice quiet, and yet I still feel like she's watching me. Not accusingly, more like she's waiting. She was, Poirot said gently, waiting for you. At that moment, Alan appeared in the doorway, a folded newspaper in his hand. The solicitor has sent word. The will is being reviewed by the trustees. They say it is valid. Ironclad. You are the legal heir. Eliza looked from Alan to Poirot, then back to the portraits. Then it is done. But Poirot shook his head slightly. Not quite. There is one more person who must hear the truth. Come, Hastings. The chapel waits. Together, we walked with Poirot and Eliza to the family chapel. The yew trees loomed overhead, branches tangled like memory. Within, the air was cool and still. At the front sat a modest plaque marking Lady Margaret's resting place. Beneath it, a newer inscription, once weathered, now polished clean. Eliza knelt and placed her hand upon the stone. "I know what you did," she whispered. "I know what you gave up, and I will not let them forget you again." Poirot stepped back, his gaze reverent. "Justice," he murmured, "is not only the punishment of the guilty. It is the restoration of the forgotten, the vindication of those who never had a voice." As we returned to the house, the midday sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Light streamed through the tall windows of Linthill Hall, striking the faces of the women in the portraits, Lady Margaret and Eliza Grant, two lives, separated by time, joined by truth. And for the first time, the house felt still, not the stillness of fear, but of peace. Evening settled gently over Linthill House, casting the tall windows in golden light and wrapping the corridors in quiet expectancy. Yet beneath the stillness, a tension hummed, subtle but undeniable. Hercule Poirot stood alone at the base of the grand staircase, his gaze fixed not on the vastness above, but on a single, unassuming plank of polished oak, the 13th step. He did not move, did not speak at first, and the weight of the moment settled around him like dust. I approached softly, not wishing to break his concentration. "Hastings," he murmured without turning, "do you know why it is always the 13th step?" I hesitated, then offered. "Superstition, perhaps?" He shook his head slowly. "None. It is a place between certainty and uncertainty, a pause in the rhythm. It is here, precisely here, where fate stops to catch its breath, and where Lady Margaret's life was ended." Kneeling with great care, Poirot ran his fingers along the underside of the step. I saw him examine faint scuff marks, the subtle splintering on the wood's edge. "This stair," he said, voice low, "was not weakened by time. It was weakened by design. Someone tampered with it. It broke beneath her weight, because they made certain that it would." Before I could respond, the sound of soft footsteps echoed from the hall. Eliza entered, hand in hand with Alan. They carried the solicitor's declaration, the formal recognition of her inheritance, the final legal affirmation that she was, indeed, the rightful heir to Linthill House. The past had bent, at last, toward truth. But Poirot raised his hand gently. "Before Linthill may rest," he said, "we must allow the house one final truth." From the far end of the corridor came the quiet sound of heels against wood. Lady Frances stepped into the light, pale and composed, though her eyes were shadowed by years of denial. She had heard everything. "I knew," she said softly, almost to herself. "I knew about the first Eliza, about the truth Margaret tried to protect, and I said nothing." Poirot turned to her, but did not accuse. His voice was calm. "You wished to protect your son, even when he conspired to silence Miss Grant." Lady Frances closed her eyes, her chin trembling. "Not at first, but after the accident near the north wing. I found Ian's coat, torn at the hem. I confronted him. He told me he only meant to frighten her, to stop her from uncovering what he saw as theft." "But fear," Poirot replied quietly, "is always the first shadow of violence." Eliza stepped forward, her voice steady despite the emotion trembling beneath it. "Then why let it continue? Why not speak when the truth was so close?" "Because I was afraid too," Lady Frances confessed, tears now falling freely. "Afraid of what it would mean. That everything I defended, everything I cherished, was built on stolen legacy." She turned to Eliza, her voice cracking. "Forgive me. I should have stood beside you, not in your way." Eliza paused, her gaze locked with Lady Frances's. Then, gently, she nodded. "Lady Margaret wanted peace, not vengeance. But silence ends with us." Poirot stepped forward and gestured to the stair. "Then let us finish what Lady Margaret began." Together, Poirot, Eliza, Alan, and I pried up the 13th step with care. Beneath the wood was a hollow compartment, untouched for generations. Dust swirled in the lantern light, but inside lay what time had failed to claim: a ribbon-bound bundle of letters, brittle but intact, and a sealed envelope marked in faded ink, "For her who bears my name." Eliza opened it with trembling hands. Inside was not only Lady Margaret's personal confession, but her final words of resolve. To my child's child. I knew they would come for me. I saw it in Andrew's eyes. But I did not fear death. I feared silence. If you read this, then you are my triumph. You are proof that truth, though buried, will rise like the sun. Remember this. Blood does not define nobility. Courage does. Silence fell, not of suppression, but of reverence. For in those few lines, Lady Margaret had done what neither death nor deception could prevent. She had spoken from beyond the grave to correct the injustice committed in her name. Poirot rose and gently dusted off his sleeves. "And so, Hastings," he said quietly, "the 13th step remembers. Not the murder, but the truth." As we returned to the drawing room, the house felt transformed. No longer burdened, but reborn. I glanced back once at the staircase, where the late sun struck the wood with golden light. And for a moment, just one breath, I imagined I saw her, Lady Margaret, standing at the top, calm and proud, watching the house she had once protected finally return to the hands of those who carried her name in truth. A soft mist had settled over Linthill by morning, silvering the hedges and laying pearl across the high grass. The house stood still, its stone walls no longer holding their breath, but exhaling, at last, the secrets they had clutched for generations. Hercule Poirot, ever composed, stood in the great hall adjusting his cuffs as though readying himself not for departure, but ceremony. There was still one final task to complete, the reading of the truth aloud. In the drawing room, now warmed by the fire's gentle glow, the remaining members of the household gathered. Eliza stood near the mantelpiece, her posture calm but solemn. Alan sat beside her, his fingers intertwined with hers, their quiet unity a new root in the old earth of Linthill. Lady Frances, once a woman of unshakable poise, now carried herself with the humility of one who has seen the scaffolding of her world dismantled, but has chosen not to deny it. Poirot held in his hands the bundle of papers uncovered beneath the 13th step, Lady Margaret's letters, the final will, and a private testament. With utmost care, he placed them on the table, and turned toward us all. "Miss Amos," he began, "what you see before you is not merely parchment. It is the end of one story, and the beginning of another. Lady Margaret, in her wisdom, concealed the truth not to spite her bloodline, but to preserve the dignity of justice. And now, after silence, deception, and danger, the truth breathes again." He gestured to Eliza. "You, mademoiselle, are not simply an heir by law. You are the daughter of this house by blood and by intention. Linthill belongs to you, not as a possession, but as a responsibility." Eliza looked down, then back at Poirot, with quiet steel. "And I intend to honor her, with openness, with peace." A tear slipped down Lady Frances's cheek as she stepped forward. "You will do better than we did. You already have." Poirot gave a slight bow. "Then my work here is done." Outside, the sun had broken through the haze, gilding the windows with warm light. I followed Poirot as he stepped through the front doors, pausing on the threshold to glance back at the manor. His gaze lingered on the staircase visible through the tall glass, on the 13th step, now repaired, polished, restored. "Justice, Hastings," he murmured, "is not merely the correction of wrongs. It is the rebalancing of memory. Linthill no longer hides. And that," he added with a rare softness, "is as it should be." As the carriage rolled down the winding path, we passed the eastern gardens, where Eliza and Alan had already begun clearing away the overgrown hedgerows. Renewal had begun, not in grand gestures, but in simple acts of restoration. Behind them, Lady Margaret's portrait had been returned to its rightful place above the great hearth, her eyes watching not with sorrow, but serenity. And just as the house faded from view, I thought I saw something in the window, the faint outline of a woman in 18th-century dress, standing in sunlight, her expression one of profound peace. "She rests now," Poirot said, without needing to look. "Yes," I whispered, "and Linthill breathes again." And with that, the long silence ended, not with thunder, but with grace.